Today's lecture is Applications of NLP Part 6, and we're going to be talking about metaphors, which is a very core element that is used in NLP. Metaphor in simple terms is usage of stories, similes, analogies, or in simple terms, examples that can be used to make sure that a person overcomes a certain belief. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So, part 6 of a long series, and there's still lots more to go. So today we will be talking about a one of the very basic tools of NLP, which is metaphors. It's not as complex to understand as some of the models that we've discussed earlier. So like something like a meta model or a Milton model sometimes takes a little bit of tuning to understand what it is. Metaphors in that sense are simple. The challenge is to be able to create one. So that's where the skill lies. So this particular thing involves a bit of skill building and not so much following a process, unlike other parts of NLP does. But they're extremely powerful. So just as a brush up, we started off with pacing, leading, we looked at rep systems. Swish pattern was an introduction to one of the many patterns. Then we looked at meta model and Milton model. Both these models work largely with the belief system of the person. The person could be yourself or somebody else that you're working on, a client, and latching on to that belief system and trying to change it or shift it into something which could be productive for the person. All across all through whatever we've discussed so far, the assumption or the basis of NLP is the purpose is to create and replicate excellence in whatever field that could be. It could simply be excellence in terms of the approach to an examination by a student. It could be something as basic as that. It doesn't have to be excellence in terms of world-breaking genius. But yes, to create excellence and shift systems. And the best part about using NLP is, unlike other forms of healing, the person doesn't even have to know that you're using it. Okay? So it's extremely subtle. So coming to today's aspect, metaphors. Metaphors can be used as a part of meta model and as a part of Milton model that we've discussed earlier, or you can use it as is also. They are mainly used to distract the person concerned from the conscious thought process. So what you're using as metaphors are stories, examples, where the person's conscious mind gets engaged in the story itself, but what you're doing is unconsciously slipping in a certain message that you want the person to imbibe. So in that sense, it's a very subtle mechanism, but extremely powerful if it is constructed and used well. So there are a couple of parts to a metaphor that we need to be aware of. One is the general story that you construct around it, story or example as the case may be. We need to ensure that the metaphor that we use is as parallel to the person's life situation as can be. So make sure that the elements are well chosen. And very importantly, whatever message is embedded in it, the message is largely the pattern that we are trying to shift. That message needs to be conveyed, if you're doing it orally, the message needs to be conveyed in a downward tone. Right? So and that goes for any embedded command in NLP. The tone goes down. The tone of the voice goes down as you deliver the message. A simple example, if I want all of us to feel calm and relaxed at this point, the embedded message that all of you are feeling calm and relaxed will need to be in a downward tone, which means I would say all of you sitting here in these chairs in this room are feeling absolutely calm and relaxed. So as I keep saying it, the message goes down in tone. Okay. Now, the assumption behind the process is that we need to be pacing and an unconscious rapport with the person that we are using the metaphor with. So in that sense, metaphor is a slightly more difficult tool to use with self. It works more easily with others. Something like the swish pattern or other patterns that we'll speak about in the future, those are very easy to use on self. metaphors, because you're constructing a story and actively involved in it, it doesn't work as well with yourself unless you're very consciously open to it. But it works very beautifully with others, and the best part is it's a conversational tool, so it doesn't even sound therapeutic or like a process in that sense. So unconscious repo is assumed, which means that you pace the person's breath, pace the body language, pace the voice, tone, the sensations of the person as much as possible. Check if the pacing is happening. The typical check that we use is we normally shift our body language and check if the person also happens to shift. Then if the person does mirror, then you know that pacing is happening, unconscious repo is present, and then you can slip in whatever message needs to be slipped in. So in terms of types of metaphors, there are primarily two. There are shallow metaphors and there are deep metaphors. The embedded part of it is, embedded metaphor is more of a process. How do you embed metaphors with other things that you're doing? So embedding it with a process that you may be using, an NLP process. It could be embedding it in a conversation that you're having in general. Sometimes the term embedded metaphor is used to indicate a very, what is called a nested loop, a complex thing of using a metaphor within a metaphor. So we will talk of one of those examples later. So coming to shallow metaphors are simple examples or parallels or analogies. The NLP term metaphor doesn't distinguish between the figure of speech term of simile and metaphor and analogy. If you remember English classes at school, we used to be taught figures of speech where each of these were distinct in nature in terms of language. In NLP, all of those are called metaphors, so we could be using any of them. So shallow metaphors are mainly explicit comparisons. So you take up a situation in life and you compare it with something else, and that something else could be any element. It could be a popular movie, it could be a character from a cartoon, it could be something from nature, absolutely anything. And shallow metaphors are mainly used to bring to the person's consciousness what he or she happens to be doing, so that there is a possibility that the person might want to shift out of it.
Sky is the limit, that will be shallow?
Yeah, that's a shallow metaphor, yes. So if the person happens to feel limited or is feeling constrained about it or cannot see possibilities, a metaphor like sky is the limit is used to expand the possibility. Yes, so that's a good example of a shallow metaphor. So a couple of examples of use there is one of the situations where you're sitting with a friend and you're watching a movie which you think is extremely boring and you don't really see sense in continuing to watch that movie, but a logical argument is not really yielding results. If you happen to be in unconscious repo, slipping in a metaphor like the one I've spoken about, that watching this movie is like watching the grass grow under your feet. If you slip that metaphor in, that there is a possibility that the person breaks out of that state, because that whole process of grass growing under your feet is a very vivid thing, and it's very explicit that it's an extremely slow and boring process. It's not productive to sit and watch it. So those kind of metaphors can be used to snap a person out of a certain situation that you think is unproductive. Or you can also help a person to shift beliefs using a shallow metaphor. So let's say if there's a person who's having trouble with a spouse or a partner and not sure of what to deal with, how to deal with the relationship, and perhaps feel that it's like a day-to-day battle with the partner. A metaphor such as saying, a marriage is like a dance and not a battlefield, shifts the person's belief in terms of saying, okay, it's not about being at war, but being able to synchronize with the person, and therefore somebody leads at some point in time, someone else is in a spotlight at another point in time. But the important thing with shallow metaphors is the metaphors themselves are really small. It could be one simple sentence. You pick up any parallel example that you're able to find around and start using it. And if you're using it with children, it usually helps if you're using an example that's very familiar to them, something like a Cinderella or a Mickey Mouse, or a very simple character, and talk about, how Cinderella happened to be released from her cruel stepmother's house. So A simple analogy like that can help. But the important thing with this is, well before you use the metaphor, you need to be in rapport.
Creative.
Yeah, so make sure that you're in that conversation for about 2-3 minutes and talking about any general thing. It doesn't even have to pertain to that topic. And then once you know that you're in rapport, then just slip it in and slip it in a downward tone, and that's it. Leave it at that. And somewhere the person's unconscious mind latches onto it. Usage of metaphors is not a conscious process. The person may not even understand what you're saying. And if for whatever reason the person happens to ask and you're not able to offer an explanation, that's also fine. It doesn't matter. All you want is the unconscious to latch onto the message, and that is that. And then the unconscious will process in its own way and start making a judgment about the situation, which seems very original to that person because the person doesn't know that he or she has received an external input, but you have slipped in that input. So these can be very powerful tools, used very well for those of you who do counseling for children. Works very beautifully because there's very little resistance with children and they pick up metaphors very quickly. Even for motivational speeches or a pep talk to somebody, slipping in a few metaphors always works very beautifully. And the important thing with shallow metaphors is don't drag it. One sentence and that's it. No explanations, no dragging, no bringing the person's attention to that metaphor. The idea is not to bring attention. Just slip it and let go. So those are shallow metaphors. The other aspect is deep metaphors. Deep metaphors take a little work to build. So you actually need to build a story around that whole process. And what deep metaphors does is maps the entire situation of the person. So the situation could be a relationship or something at work, or anything that's troubling the person, even a health issue, and use the language of the unconscious mind. So again, like with shallow metaphors, we are not addressing the conscious mind. So sometimes a deep metaphor may sound like a story without a head or tail, and that's perfectly okay, because assuming that you are in unconscious rapport, the other person is in a conscious trance, so he or she receives that message without even understanding it. So end of the conversation, if you happen to be using these kind of metaphors, sometimes you find that the person may feel a little disoriented at the end of the conversation because there was no particular sense to it, but then the message has gone through. In fact, it's a good sign if the person doesn't quite remember the conversation at the end of it, because you know that the person has been in a trance. So one of the examples that I've used here is constructed around a situation who was a workaholic, so to say, very busy and extremely aggressive, competitive at work, but on the flip side, unable to have a sustained, meaningful relationship because there's practically no time to meet a person or build a proper relationship, and therefore this person ends up with casual flings and extremely disappointed and has come to a space of belief that I am not meant for a relationship. It's not for me to try and build one. So one of the metaphors that can work in such kind of a case is this particular story that I've got there, where it's a story of a panda in a forest. The more far-flung the analogy, the better, because the person's conscious mind doesn't come into play. If you happen to use a human example here, there is a likelihood that the conscious mind will start associating with it and analyzing it. So something like an animal or a flower or a cartoon character, make sure that the person is at ease, the defenses are down because the person doesn't think he is being addressed. So the mind is very open to receive whatever comes up. Yeah, because once the conscious mind starts engaging, then there is that analysis saying, no, my situation is slightly different from this one. Right? So you don't want to bring that in. It's not incorrect to do that. If you don't find any other analogy, go ahead and use it. It's just that with using a human analogy, you need to be very confident that you're in absolute rapport. So then there is no resistance. Otherwise, something like an animal or a flower totally drops the resistance down because the conscious mind says, okay, this has nothing to do with me. So the message is received.
He saw fables.
Yeah,
Exactly.
a lot of them work beautifully as metaphors. The Aesop's fables, the Panchatantra stories, they work very beautifully as metaphors. So something that I've used here is to tell this person after getting into rapport that, so there was this panda in this forest who would be foraging for food all day because pandas live in high altitude, so food is not very abundant. So the panda believes that unless I forage and keep looking for food all day, I will end up starving. In the process, he doesn't really have time to find a mate, and he feels very lonely in the winters because there's nobody else around. One day he realizes that it's okay, a little bit of hunger will not kill me, so even if I spare an hour or two and not hunt for food in that time, it's alright, I think I should be able to manage. So one fine day this panda decides that, okay, I'm going to take a rest from foraging and I'm going to go socialize with other pandas. So he does that, goes and plays, and in that process meets another panda who happens to have had a similar thought process, and a beautiful relationship blossomed. Right? And you leave it at that. The thing with metaphor is you don't get into moral of the story and preaching and any of that. You just finish the metaphor, leave it at that, talk about the weather if you want to. Right? You can have an abrupt end to a metaphor and switch to a topic, and that's perfectly okay. Metaphors don't have to have a proper head or a tail, but yes, within themselves they need to be very well constructed, in the sense you need to pick up all the elements from the person's life. So in this case you're talking of person too busy, you're parallelly saying, okay, there's this panda who's extremely busy, right? There doesn't have relationships, again you've taken the idea of doesn't have relationships. In this case I've supported it with the elemental aspect of panda being in the snow and therefore lonely. That element of loneliness is brought in by the environment here. And then you talk of how you take time off, a parallel example, and then construct the story accordingly. The important part is you have to take a beginning, take the desired end. The desired end in the person's case was to be able to invest time in a relationship, and you bring that desired end into the story and end it at that. So the entire thing needs to be delivered in a very calm, conversational manner, and towards the end, the last message, which is that a relationship blossomed, needs to be in that downward tone so that the message gets embedded. So if you wish, you can also what they call analog mark certain points of the message. For example, the important aspects that you want the person to do is to take time off. That's one thing you really want the person to do. So something like taking time off specifically can be in a downward tone. So you can mark those parts of the message which are important for the person, specifically ensure that the downward tone is used and you're in absolute rapport when you're delivering that, so that there is more power in the message. But with deep metaphors, it takes a little bit of building. So if you happen to know the story or the situation of the person beforehand, it usually helps. So if you wish to create metaphors, for those of us who are good storytellers and readers, and if you're the sort who can remember stories easily, great, then you're a natural at metaphors. You just need to pick it up and deliver it in the right manner. For those of us like me who can't for the life of me remember stories when I need to, I tend to use a process for it. So you define what the desired outcome is. So you understand the person's situation, figure out where is it that you want to lead the person into. You clarify the current context. So what's the desired outcome? What is the current status of the person? And then you identify what are the resources. Now resources are largely internal resources, emotional resources, or a change of perspective that is needed by the person to shift from that unproductive state of mind. So you do those three, and then you figure out which are the key characters. One is the person himself or herself. Are there any influencers? Right? Sometimes there could be a partner, a parent, a child who happens to be influencing the person's thought process, and those influencers also need to be part of the story if necessary. Right? So who are the key characters? What is the relationship with those characters? Is it positive, negative? Which of them is troubled? What nature of trouble? Map the current strategies which are being used. So how is the person dealing with that situation and those characters at this point in time? And what are the possible new strategies? So if there is an unhealthy interaction at this point, what could be a healthy interaction? And then after you have all these elements in place, just put those together as a story and then use it as a part of a conversation. So an example of used here is that of a student who happens to have a phobia of exams or gets extremely worked up before exams happen. Right? So the outcome that you want to create is a relaxed student. Right? Current situation is that the student is extremely scared of any kind of examination and therefore goofs up even if he happens to have worked very hard at it. So what are the resources the person needs? The person needs confidence and the person needs focus. Right? The influential characters at this point are one, the student himself or herself, the parents because they influence the process, and also peers because there's that constant comparison with friends and roommates and classmates. Right? So the elements that currently happen are one, there is pressure from the parents that you have to do well. And there is also that constant peer comparison which makes the person feels uncomfortable and anxious. As a result, the current situation is there are sleepless nights, the student happens to study too much and doesn't, as a result, doesn't feel good enough or fresh enough for the exam. And the schedule doesn't really allow for any sort of recreation, doesn't have time to play, mix with friends. So what are the tools that we can use? We could use, you could help the person build mnemonic tools. Mnemonic tools are any memory building tool like a smart card, making short notes in a small flashcard which he can use to revise easily. So you can use that, and very importantly have a balanced lifestyle which will help the person relax. So considering all these elements, you make up a story and start using that in a conversation. So in this case, I've the story or the metaphor that I have created is an example of embedded metaphor, which means I've used a metaphor within a metaphor. The advantage with embedded metaphors is usually the conscious mind gets engaged with that whole remembrance process of what is looped within what, and in that process the unconscious mind is free to grasp whatever message you happen to grasp. So the story that I've used in this case is to have a general conversation with that student. In this case I've used a human metaphor. So I've said that, okay, you know, that there was, like you happen to be scared of exams, there was another boy called Jack. Now Jack was a budding musician. He was a student who was learning guitar for several years and scheduled to perform on stage with a few of his fellow classmates, guitar classmates. Now the elements here are picked up exactly from this particular student situation, which means there is peer pressure, there is performance issue, exam is an analogy for performance, and there is that whole aspect of being a student for several years which is replicated. So you pick up parallel elements. Right? So there's this Jack who has guitar performance, and he was nervous because there would be a vast audience and there are several of his peers who are great performers. So he knows that they sometimes do better than him, and therefore Jack practiced day and night but felt restless and scared. So in building this premise, you've duplicated the entire situation of the student's life, but then the context is very different. So you've picked up something like playing guitar, which has nothing to do with that student. Right? So here the assumption I've used that this particular student who needs to be relaxed doesn't have anything to do with music. So try and pick up a context which is as different from it. Right? So if you happen to know that this particular student also plays music, then music may not be a good example. Probably pick up a dance performance or an art exhibition or something of that sort. The idea is pull the context away as much as possible. And then you build a story around it. So here I've embedded another thing to say that, okay, so one day Jack's uncle came to visit him and he saw how anxious Jack was. And then the uncle said, now this part is the message part which needs to be very clearly delivered in that downward tone. I'll read it as is. I've said that do you know all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, which is a shallow metaphor which is put in already, right? And then you can use it further to say giving a performance is like getting honey from nature. Again, another shallow metaphor embedded in it. So you keep putting metaphors into metaphors. While the hard work of all the bees collecting the nectar is one part of it, the other important part is how flowers generate the nectar. And do you know how? Simply by enjoying the sun and the rain, waving in the breeze and resting against the leaves. So the flowers simply enjoy and the nectar just happens to them. They're not working hard towards it. So if the flowers didn't do their part, there would be no nectar for the bees to collect. So the element of the bee is used to indicate hard work, that the bees go back and forth between millions of flowers to collect the nectar. And at the same time, you're saying that the flower is how the person should ideally be, just play, sing, dance, and in that process the network will happen. You get nourished and the network just happens, the nectar just happens. So Jack understood. So you continue that story and you say Jack understood and make sure that he practiced regularly, but he also went out to play and enjoyed himself. And in that process, he became inspired by the skills of his peers rather than getting intimidated by it. He was also encouraged by the words of the parents rather than feeling bogged down by the pressure of it. And finally, he was at ease. And this again needs to be embedded downward tone because that's a message you want for the person. He felt at ease during his stage performance and received a standing ovation for his natural brilliance. So that entire thing is one embedded metaphor which has several other loops of metaphors in it. So this entire thing can be delivered as a general story in a conversation with that child, and the unconscious mind, because the unconscious mind is busy picking up loops of what is happening within what, the conscious mind is engaged and the unconscious mind picks up the message that is required and then it starts acting in the process. So that's an example of creating metaphors. Now, like I said, for those of you for whom storytelling or remembering, very importantly, story remembering is natural, great, you'll find it extremely easy. Just focus on the delivery part of it. Otherwise, it helps to actually follow that whole creation process for a while. And especially if you're doing any therapeutic sessions or counseling sessions, it helps to really do this process even if you're good at telling stories, because you really want the elements to be just perfect. You want the exact element of the client reflecting in the story with the context being totally different. So it really helps to edit that story a bit and be prepared with it when you're delivering it to the person. And they work beautifully for all kinds of situations. Metaphors work in terms of counseling, in terms of motivation, if you want to motivate somebody to sell better or have a better self-image, more confidence. Works extremely beautifully, and in a way it is the most natural form of conversational hypnosis. It doesn't feel like there are any straitjacketed, unnatural statements. It's like a general conversation where you're sharing a story. Right? So nothing needs to change. You don't have to adopt a particular body language or a posture or any of that. All you need to do is mind the tone a little bit, and beyond a point even that gets pretty natural. Of course, you can add humor as much as possible. The conscious mind loves humor, so it's absolutely engaged in it. The unconscious mind, the idea is engage the conscious mind as much as possible, so the unconscious is free to pick up messages.
Because indirectly it may create trance also.
Yes, yeah, because these are called nested loops, where you're beginning one loop. So there is one loop about Jack learning guitar, then you're beginning another loop inside it which is about this uncle coming, then the uncle is talking about bees and nectar, which is another loop. Then you close one by one each loop, and the mind is very busy grasping all those loops. In the process, the unconscious is free and it picks up the message. So the idea, if you're able to use humor, great, that's a beautiful tool to use with the metaphor. So yeah, those are metaphors, and a couple of resources which I find pretty helpful to find the right metaphors, especially for counseling sessions. There's a gentleman called Brian Cullen. He has a website called briancullen.net, Brian Cullen. Cullen. Yeah. So he has a huge laundry list of stories which are extremely.
It is here only, na?
Yes, you can take it. Yeah. Brian Cullen, and then there is an Indian gentleman who's settled in the US called Tyagi, who has a website called tyagi.com, where there are several other resources apart from NLP, but if you search for formula stories, he's got a few other formula like the structure I showed. There are a couple of other interesting formulas that his team has developed on creating metaphors or stories, as the case may be. So, a couple of pretty good resources that are useful for you to learn metaphors.